So I'd like to talk about educating for intellectual character, something that correctional education programs often miss, and why that matters. About 20 years ago, the Bureau of Justice Statistics told us that something like 95% of the people currently incarcerated will one day be released. They will become your neighbors, your coworkers, classmates, people in the checkout line, potentially a TEDx speaker, or someone attendant in the audience. One of the important questions we want to ask is, what kind of person do we want sent back into society when historically prison has made people worse, not better? And a common answer is, well, we want people who are employable, people who have job skills, people who can contribute to the workforce. And part of the reasoning behind that is because there's a connection between unemployment, job skills, and higher crime rates and eventually recidivism rates in coming back to prison. But I think this is a more thoughtful response to this, is to say that we want people who are well educated, not just in job training, but in character-forming liberal education, which cultivates things like critical thinking, intellectual humility, moral reasoning. Now, to be clear, this is not an either-or dilemma, because I know when we talk about liberal arts education, people often roll their eyes, especially when it comes to educating people in prison. It's not as if we do vocational-style job skills training or something else. This is a both-and proposition. We can do both, and we have to. And this is not unique to me. Martin Luther King told us over 75 years ago that intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. It wasn't new when he said it either. This is actually an ancient perspective, but it's never been a popular perspective, especially when it comes to educating people in prison. But it helps us remember that it's not just about what you know, but who you become as a part of the educational process. And this is important because, again, the kinds of people coming back from prison are going to be our coworkers, our neighbors, citizens. And when we're often making decisions about what kind of educational opportunities to provide people, part of that is driven by who we think they are, what we think their potential is, what we think their worth is, what we think their capacity is. Now, I've taught in prisons for 15 years now, and I actually served time in prison between the ages of 16 and 24. I had the opportunity to begin my college career while serving time in prison, and a few years ago, I finally finished a really long academic journey with a doctorate of education from the University of St. Thomas right here in Houston, Texas. So I can tell you from experience that prison education changes lives. Now, in the past, people needed to be convinced that this was even a good idea to offer education in prison. Most people today agree with that. They don't need to be convinced any longer, but the overwhelming focus is on vocational job skills type training. And that's fine. It's practical and it works and it gets people jobs, but we can do better. And in fact, in the age of AI, we have to. Correctional education in the U.S. seems to be based on the belief that employment is rehabilitation. But if you can't think critically, if you can't think reflectively, if you can't think in an open-minded way or empathize with others, then having job skills doesn't necessarily alleviate what brought you to prison in the first place. You can be a great welder, phenomenal mechanic, and still be a potential menace to society. Employment is an important part of rehabilitation, but it's not the complete picture. So I'd like to say something about a fuller, more holistic picture when it comes to education in prison. I get to teach philosophy to students working on vocational certificates and business degrees at the associate's degree level. In doing so, I often focus on human qualities or character traits that are not always measured in your standard assessments and tests, but they are in fact essential for life. These kind of qualities or character traits have to do with one's intellectual character and are often referred to as intellectual virtues. An intellectual virtue is simply a character trait of a good thinker, a good learner. An example of an intellectual virtue would be something like open-mindedness, the willingness to consider other people's perspectives, especially those that contradict your own. Another example would be something like intellectual humility, which is your ability to realize or recognize that your current beliefs and opinions could, in fact, be wrong. These things help us navigate disagreement. They help us make better judgments when faced with moral dilemmas. In other words, they make us better thinkers and learners, and subsequently make us better human beings. And unfortunately, decades of research on the benefits of things like open-mindedness and intellectual humility in terms of conflict resolution, reduction in polarization is untapped in the field of correctional education and criminal justice. For my dissertation, I wanted to understand whether or not there was some kind of a relationship between the education provided in the prison system, which is largely vocational in some college, if there was a relationship between that education and their achievement and these intellectual virtues. In other words, do people who go through the currently existing correctional education programs, do they become more or less open-minded, more or less intellectually humble, more or less in terms of their moral reasoning skills? In other words, can you go through these programs and develop in these qualities? And for the purposes of this talk, the basic answer was no. There is no relationship between one's intellectual character and virtues and the existing correctional education opportunities. So somebody can go through these vocational programs and sometimes college educational programs and still come out closed-minded, arrogant, gullible, and prone to conspiratorial thinking, which is a bit of a problem. So what does this mean? To me, it meant that to the degree that we care about the incarcerated developing this aspect of their character, the currently existing opportunities are unrelated to that. Now, to be sure, there are programs in prison which somewhat deal with these things through something like cognitive behavioral therapy or sometimes the chaplaincy classes, but these are very limited in scope, and at least when I looked into the matter, there was virtually nothing across the nation that had anything to do with the development of things like critical thinking, intellectual character, or intellectual virtues in the prison systems. So something else needs to be added to the bigger picture. We're teaching people how to work, but not necessarily how to think. We're teaching people how to potentially survive, but not necessarily how to flourish. And when people return with job skills, but no ability to think critically or reflectively or navigate disagreements with others, that's not just their individual burden, but the burden of families, neighborhoods, and communities. So the good news is that these intellectual virtues can, in fact, be developed. They can be taught. They can be measured. You can, in fact, grow and develop in your open-mindedness or intellectual humility. So imagine the prison classroom that, in addition to teaching those job skills, those necessary survival skills that they'll need upon release, in addition to that, they're also being taught to think critically about, why do I believe the things that I believe? What if I'm wrong? Why do other people believe so strongly about the things they believe? Imagine that kind of programming engaging them in civic engagement and critical thinking. That kind of education will enable all students, especially incarcerated students, to survive in a world that is dominated by AI and the fears of our future. In fact, the kind of prompt engineering, this particular skill which is important for us to access AI chatbots, is simply learning to critically think about the questions you're trying to ask, the variables that you want to input, the prompts that you want to create. That kind of education doesn't just help people survive, but enables them to flourish, especially in this postmodern world of AI. And we already know that this character education works in other settings. In the K through 12 setting, you may have heard of things like the Harmony Public Schools or the KIPP schools, Knowledge and Power programs, where they emphasize things like character education. And as far as we know, these things do in fact improve grades, behavior, reduce polarization, increase students' levels of empathy. So why would we not want to incorporate that into the prison systems and the correctional education systems? Because again, they will return one day and be our neighbors, classmates, and coworkers. If we want safer communities and stronger democracies, then we need to not just care about returning citizens being able to work, but that they can actually think well, live ethically, and lead with empathy. That starts with how we see each other, because what we determine or what we allow them to be educated in is often determined by how we see them first, how we see their worth, their potential, and their capacities. If we view them as simply future laborers, we will give them training. If we view them as future citizens, neighbors, and leaders, we will give them transformation. So let's reimagine what correctional education can do, not just in terms of preparing people for jobs, but thinking about the kind of people that it shapes. And let's remember what Dr. King told us, that intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. Thank you.